Welcome to Cross Connections, Season 2, Cover to Cover, as we read along with you each week and discuss the Bible from Genesis to Revelation. Join us as we discover how these stories connect us to God, to our inner selves, and to one another in a world that tries so hard to disconnect us. Well, welcome all of you today. We are in the second... Oh goodness, we've finished Genesis, and we are now going to start talking about Exodus. And today we have with us a very special guest, the Rabbi Robert Green. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here with all of you.
Hi, Robert.
Hello.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about yourself?
I am the rabbi of Congregation B'nai Israel in Basking Ridge, New Jersey.
I've heard of that place.
You have heard of that place because that's where you used to be too.
Yes.
But you weren't the rabbi there, were
I
you?
was not the rabbi.
But he could have been. And you gave sermons there.
I did.
You did. So that's how I know Rick, and that was my good fortune. And I'm really happy to be here in Wayne.
Yep.
That's right.
Yeah, this is nice. And I have to say, I'm very impressed. You've already done the book of Exodus, and you just started a week ago. Could you teach us how we're still like on the third chapter?
Wow. Don't talk to the Friday morning men's Bible study. I think they've been in Genesis for like 7 years.
No.
They must be Jewish.
Right.
So technically, by our reading plan, we would be finishing out, the last few chapters of Genesis here. We talked about that last week, tried to kind of close that out so we can move on into Exodus and focus on that this week. Let's talk a little bit about what's going on with Exodus here. So obviously, the end of Genesis, we had the people leaving the land that they were promised and moving into Egypt because of the famine. And so now we start off Exodus. We are in Egypt.
I also want to just back out a little bit more, like 35,000 feet, and just say we're still in the narrative story section of the Torah.
Right.
So stories and characters that are probably familiar to most of us from Sunday school. We're in very friendly territory because everything's a story and everything's interesting and fun and things are happening and moving. That is going to change when we get to the next episode, because the second half of Exodus is a lot less narrative and story and a lot more of something else, but we'll get to that.
Preview for next week.
Yeah. So
Right.
my first question for Rabbi Green is, in this story that is familiar to many of us, what are some things that people might miss about the story of Exodus? Or what are things that Christians might miss about the story of Exodus?
I don't know if they would miss it or not, but I think it's worth saying that the book of Exodus, the story of the Exodus, is the foundational story of the Jewish people. And this is the reason, this story, if you think in terms of psychological experiences, when people have near-death experiences or when they go through traumatic experiences and they survive them, they sometimes say, well, now I know I have a reason for being here. Now I have a mission and I want to do something, or I feel like I need to do something. Exodus is sort of that story for the Jewish people. They were enslaved. Many of them died. They were strangers in a foreign land. And when they were able to gain their freedom, and then they got the commandments, but gaining that freedom was their survival of that traumatic event. A near-death experience. And so because of that, it's like that was their mission. Okay, we're still here, and we know what it's like to be enslaved, and we didn't want to be enslaved, and we don't want to be enslaved. We know what it's like to be oppressed, and we don't want to oppress. We don't want to be oppressed. We don't want to oppress other people. We don't want to enslave other people. this is why we want to be the way we want to be, because we've had these experiences and we know what they're like. And when we tell the story of the Exodus every year at the Passover Seder, we tell it in the first person. We don't say when my ancestors, we say when I was. So we think of ourselves as having gone through this experience. And in every generation, we remind ourselves that because of our experience, we have a mission in life. We want to be a certain way, and that's how we want to live, and that's how we want to engage with the world.
Can I ask a quick follow-up question, Robert?
Sure.
So you referenced something, Passover Seder, and I'm just cognizant that some listeners might not even know what that means. So would you say a little bit about how the Exodus is commemorated in Passover and what Passover entails and where that tradition comes from?
So Passover is a holiday that's celebrated for 8 days once a year in the springtime, and it commemorates the exodus of the people Israel from Egypt. And when they left, the story goes that they left so quickly that they didn't even have time to let their dough rise before they baked it into bread. So they put it on their backs and off they went, and it baked in the hot sun. And so it didn't rise, and for that reason, we remember it by eating something called matzah, which is really a cracker. It's flour and water, and from start to finish, you can't take more than 18 minutes. Once water touches the flour, it has to be out of the oven within 18 minutes, or it's not considered to be proper for Passover. So we eat matzah for 8 days to commemorate that. And we have something called a Seder, the first night and the second night. And Seder means order. And so there's an order of rituals that we go through, and we read the story. We retell the story. And we retell the story in every generation for the children of that generation, so that they too will understand what their history is, that this is their experience as well.
Wow.
And so we want to pass this on. And this is Lador Vador, from generation to generation. This is the big thing that's passed on from generation to generation, because knowing the story, this gives us our marching orders. This tells us why we want to be the way we want to be in the world. Now I have to then add on to that. We're not always successful,
Sure.
obviously.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah. So, and this is, I happen to make notes. So that comes from editorially, Exodus chapter 12-ish is where the institution of the Passover happens. So if you're looking for where that is exactly, if you haven't read along precisely.
And so when you call this a foundational story, it's so foundational that it's retold in community around a table and it's told as you are a participant in this story of redemption and liberation and freedom.
And often what people will do during Seders with children is they'll reenact it. They'll do a little play.
Wow.
And when our kids were young, at least one time, we had a Seder that began in a tent. So just to give them that experience of, it was a tent in our living room, but nevertheless it was a tent.
Right.
And just to give them that experience of, okay, this is what we're talking about. This is what happened. This is...
And so I haven't been at a Seder where they went that far and reenacted. How far back do you go? Are you reenacting like the whole situation with the plagues, or are you just from the lamb's blood on the lintels, or...
So that's an interesting question. Some people might go back and reenact the plagues too, or at least talk about them. You can't, you're not really going to be able to turn blood to water. I guess you could use food coloring, but but so they talk about, we talk about all the plagues. And in fact, one of the things that happens during the Seder when we're sitting around the table is that we read all of the plagues. And so we have, one of the things that's very common in the Jewish way of living is to have a cup of wine to sanctify, to make holy the day. And so we have 4 cups of wine during the Passover Seder. And during one of those cups, we read the plagues, we list all the plagues, and we take a drop of wine out of the cup and put it on our plates, and we don't drink that because we're reducing some of our joy, because we don't want the plagues to have happened, if that makes sense.
Right, yeah.
So the plagues are talked about, but they're sort of mourned as well. That's nobody would ever hope to have plagues like that done to anyone.
Yeah.
What are some of the key themes that Jewish commentators, and I know that, the first couple chapters of Exodus are chock full of detail and exquisite detail, and I know, the ancient rabbinical commentators did a lot with these first chapters of Exodus. They're just poured over. And so what are some of the key themes that some of these Jewish commentators might look at?
So one is that God doesn't forget Israel. One is that the relationship to Israel, the relationship between God and Israel, is as important to God as it is to the people Israel. That, God disappeared, at least it seems that God disappeared for 400 years. And but God then came back, and there's a question: did this happen because God wanted to have an opportunity to demonstrate to the people Israel God's power and might, and so they would listen to God when God said, "Thou shalt," and so on. But so that's just sort of an interesting thing to think about. People talk about that a lot.
I have people all the time in my ministry, and I wonder if in your work you have the same thing. People go through something kind of terrible and awful, and they'll go, "Why me? Why? I'm a good person. I go to church. I give. I go to the food bank, and this terrible thing has happened to me. And why?" And then you have the story of God's people suffering in slavery for 400 years.
And when people say "why me," those are their Jewish roots. Because let me explain. God created humans in one being, and that's so that nobody would ever be able to say my family line is better than your family line. So we know we all have this same family line coming from Adam and Eve. So when the people Israel were in the desert after slavery, they constantly said, "Why us? Let us go back. We know what life is like there. Why are you putting us through this? Why me?" So when you have people say, "Why me?" you can tell them they have Jewish roots.
Well, yeah, you do kind of wonder sometimes why this moment, right? We kind of understand from Genesis why the people Israel, who were, I think one of the points that's interesting that you mentioned, Rick, before we got started, is that in Genesis we're really dealing with a family, and they're very clear about, like, there were 70 people in the family, right, who then ended up going to Egypt, and that was Jacob and Jacob's whole family unit, right? And you understand that they end up in Egypt because it's God's way kind of rescuing them from the famine that had been happening in Genesis. So now here they are in Egypt, and you wonder, like, why did it take this many generations? Why now? Was it because it had gotten so bad? Was it because Moses was born and he was great? Why that moment in history did that need, or in spiritual history, because I don't want to get into any kind of archaeological whatever here, but why spiritually in our history did it happen at that moment? I don't even know if there's an answer to that, but
there's a question where one of the themes that is talked about and thought about is the idea, this will sound familiar to you, that a child is born and deals with difficult circumstances and ultimately becomes a great savior of sorts. Sound familiar?
Oh gosh, a couple weeks ago,
I've heard of a few people like that.
And so that's one of the themes. That's what's talked about. Was Moses? Did it happen because Moses was born and Moses was great, or Moses was asked by God to take on this role, and against his will he did it? Basically, God twisted his arm. According to the story, but But so, but you can't really answer that question. But there are lots of ideas. That's one. But the other idea is that another idea is that this is going to show people God's might and power, and that this powerful God, if God had done anything any earlier, perhaps the people of Israel wouldn't have taken it seriously. Would have just thought, oh well, of course, this is what should happen to us. This is what we deserve. We're people. But they had endured 400 years of slavery and poor treatment, and their children their sons were getting tossed in the water and killed. So, when God came to save them at this point, that's a big deal. That's going to make an impression. So that's really going to give them something to think about. Even still, they fetched all the way through the desert.
Yeah.
Of course.
I don't want to come out swinging with really hard questions off the bat here, Robert, but I'm curious because
he can take it.
Let's see. I'm curious because you talked about this idea of showing God's power and might, which really is a big part of the beginning of the Exodus, right? I thought it was so interesting about the plagues when you said there was this sense in the Passover celebration and commemoration of we wouldn't want these plagues, right? And, I know for a lot of Christian interpreters and throughout history, there has been significant wrestling with the justice of the plagues, frankly, and really specifically the fact that they didn't really seem necessary in the sense of, and where I'm going with this is, God talks about hardening Pharaoh's heart, and there's almost this sense of like, Pharaoh could have let them go after plague 1. Right?
Yeah.
So I'm just curious how, Jewish interpreters have handled that, how you have handled that, if you've had those questions in your context. Just any insight into what you think about that.
If God could harden Pharaoh's heart, God could soften Pharaoh's heart.
Right. I wrote that note myself. Why did God not choose to soften it?
I've asked that question many, many times, and the answer that I hear most often is that God needed to show God's strength so that people would take God seriously. I'm probably not the most mainstream. I might be a little left of center here, or very left of center. But I would say, if God has that kind of power, couldn't God show the people in a different way? But and that's a question that a lot of people ask in the Jewish world. Why'd you have to do that?
I remember one of the times I came and preached at your synagogue, I talked about the Midrash, and Midrash is a Jewish tradition of storytelling that sort of fills in the cracks of the stories. Is that fair? And there's a Midrash of the time when the Egyptians were being drowned in the Red Sea. And the angels in heaven were rejoicing because God had, overthrown Pharaoh. And as the Midrash goes, God silenced the angels and said, "Those are my children too." And so the fact that this story exists tells us that there were ancient rabbis who wrestled with, who are God's children, and why does sometimes good things happen to us and bad things happen to them, and vice versa. And this Midrash, I forget who the rabbi was who did that. Do you remember who?
It's a very common Midrash.
It's a common Midrash.
Yeah.
That we really wanted to emphasize the fact that we're all God's children. And so the ones who suffered through the plagues, they were God's children. The ones who drowned in the Red Sea were God's children.
And that's that also is spoken to in the understanding that this is because we've had this experience, we don't want to have it again. We don't want anyone to have it.
Yeah.
In the same way, the Egyptians shouldn't have had to drown in the sea. The Egyptians shouldn't have had to lose their firstborn children. The plagues didn't need to happen. In a better world, they wouldn't have happened.
Right. Well, go ahead, Natalie.
I'm sorry. I was going to say, I did notice when I was reading that there was like a moment that seemed like a moment of mercy in the plagues, and it was, and it may have gotten wiped out by the plague that came after it, but, well, first of all, one of the things I hadn't noticed before is the way that in all of Egypt, all of this happened, except in Goshen, where the Israelites were, which I had not caught in previous readings of the scripture before. But there was a spot in the sixth plague, where there was the mercy where the barley and the flax were ruined, but the wheat and the spelt hadn't blossomed or bloomed yet, so those were okay. Those crops were okay, which almost felt like a mercy of, well, we killed off all of these crops, but there will still be food for them later.
Huh.
I had never caught that.
What a detail.
I wonder where that is.
It's a really interesting detail.
Yeah,
That's
let
great.
me see if I can find that specific.
Well, it's interesting too, right? Because not to jump ahead, but it seems like one of the themes here in Exodus, and maybe we can speak to this, Robert, is the revelation of God's character in a way that seems fuller than in Genesis. And what I'm thinking of in particular is, we'll talk about in our next episode, Exodus 34, the revelation of God's attributes. And that is very different than what we find here, right? I mean, it says the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, right? So there's a real tension there with what we find here in the beginning of Exodus, which you could speak to that. But I'm also thinking, certainly not as fully formed, but Exodus 3, that revelation of to Moses of, who should I tell them? What is your name? And it's and I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on that and what that means in the Jewish tradition. I am who I am, or I know there's some other ways of translating it, but some interesting revelations of God's character and attributes and names through the actions and through spoken revelation.
So Aviva Gottlieb Zornberg, whom Rick knows well, you probably know well too, talks about how God's looks at the Bible in terms of character development, like you would in a theatrical production. And God's character develops throughout the Torah as well. And so early on, God is far less mature than God becomes later on. And as all humans do, not to say that God is human, but God has lapses too. Even in God's mature times, God gets angry and acts on that. As we see later on in Exodus, the attributes of God, the 13 attributes, that's perhaps that's a development of God, or perhaps that's a hope for this is how God will be, or this is how God will be as time continues.
Yeah.
So we certainly see God at God's best and God at God's worst,
right,
throughout the Torah, and that's a good example.
For me, I see that as a reflection of the people who are writing the story about God. That they sometimes write in their own immaturity, and sometimes they write in their maturity, and they overlay their own immaturity or maturity upon the God that they're talking about.
Right. And so when you say that, what you're alluding to is that the Torah is not necessarily written by God or dictated by God to Moses, but that it's written by humans, perhaps divinely inspired. And then I think of a book that you and I read together with a group of people, written by Rob Bell. How did the Torah get written? Something like that.
What is the Bible?
What is the Bible? Yeah. That's a better title. And it'll sell more copies. And so what he asks is, why is this in the Torah right here? Why is this piece, why did the writers...
Why was the story told?
Why was the story told?
Why is the story still told?
Exactly. And so then you think about, why did the 13 attributes get put in? You think about what came before that, and maybe they wanted a different idea. We don't want God to look like this bad guy.
Yeah.
We want God to be a loving God.
Right.
So that's the first, slow to anger. That's this is the beginning of that.
Yeah, that's great. One of the things we've encouraged the readers to maybe consider is the kind of compositional history of the Torah, and the fact that some of these writings may have happened at quite later dates than the events being expressed. And I'm struck by thinking through that, the role that, when we talked about this some in Genesis, the Babylonian exile would have played when this was being written, right? And talking about God's power and might and revelation, that
absolutely
in those stories as well, I can imagine there was a hope for deliverance again, as they're putting these stories together, that in their own present moment of exile and subjugation and oppression, there is a hope that God will act yet again. So that's maybe a good reminder here as well.
And that a people who needed liberation were thinking back and reflecting and praying on the other time they needed liberation, and that God showed up then, and so perhaps God's going to show up again.
Right. Yeah.
That's a great point, and that's something that people continue to think. People continue to say, "Oh, maybe God will come and help out. I need God to come now." And think about our prayers.
Yeah,
This happens all the time. We're always asking God for help and salvation
in various traditions.
The music that came out of American slavery, is all "Swing Low, Sweet Chariot," right? Like, we're going through this awful time right now. We're slaves again. And God, it's God who is going to save us.
Yeah. And, one of the other things that's clear is that God comes in and plays a part many times, and God asks the people to do something too.
Yes.
So, again, with some of the stuff we talked about previously about in Genesis and establishing the relationship between God and the people, it's not one way. It's not just God does stuff for the people. The people have to do things as well. And sometimes it's worship and praise, and sometimes it's actually acting, going when called.
And the people that God calls to do the acting are not always pure. So Moses,
or excited about the job.
And they're not excited about the job. Moses had killed somebody, right? He was a murderer. And yet God chooses him. And then Moses tries to get out of it several times before God's like, "No, you're doing this." And so God can work through and with flawed vessels.
I believe that God actually, the translation says that God gets angry with Moses and said, "Okay, let's get going. You're going to do this. You've got your brother. It'll be fine."
His brother he'd never mentioned previously.
Right.
Well, it also comes to mind during this that as well, it's not always Israelites in the story, or people that maybe are identified as the heroes, even if they are flawed, like Moses or Abram or Sarah. I think back to our Genesis episode on Hagar, and Hagar's the one who names God El Roy, the God who sees. And here, there's these two midwives, Shiphrah and Puah, and it's these two women you would never expect, but they're named, and they play a really decisive role in the beginning, right at the start of this story. And what is it, chapter 1? I think it's chapter 1, verse 15. And they are named as Hebrew midwives. I have read commentary that they may not have been Israelites based on their names. But verse 15, one of whom was named Shiphrah and the other Puah. That they are decisive in this story. And I just think that's phenomenal, that we don't think of them often when we think of Exodus, but really a lot of this couldn't have happened without them.
And sometimes there's like small moments, like Moses' wife, Zipporah. I don't believe that she was Israelite in any way.
Her father
Midianite.
She's Midianite.
Specifically called a priest of Midian.
Yeah.
Right.
So not...
Yeah, and there's a very strange, odd little moment that happens as a quick little interlude where she does something that makes it clear that, like, she's kind of part of this deal now. Like, her action prevented God from oddly asking Moses to go do something and then trying to kill him, which we're not going to get too much into that right now, but it was weird. But here she was, and she took an action which, allowed things to continue.
Yeah.
Anyway, I would love, actually, though, Robert, if you would talk just a little bit about that moment in Exodus 3 where God speaks to Moses and says, so it's, in my translation says, I am who I am, but then in the little subnote it says, or I am what I am, or I will be what I will be. And I'm just really curious about that little moment, because that I am who I am kind of feels like it's a thing that lives in the zeitgeist.
It does. And actually, when you were doing like this, I thought you were going to say it fills the whole space.
And
my arms I am who I am. I will be who I will be. I will be what I will be. I am what I am. That they do fill up all the space, which is just an interesting thing when you think about God filling up all the space and God having to contract God's self. It's called tzimtzum. The term is tzimtzum, which is to contract in order to make space for the world and humanity and all of life on the earth. So the idea of God being I am who I am is that, it's many things, but you can understand it as, God is saying, I'm everything. I filled this whole world, and I've contracted myself. I've made space for the world as it is, but I'm still here, and I'm in every part of everything that happens, and I can't be separated, which is interesting because, today we think, okay, one of the things I say to my congregants is that it's on our shoulders, it's upon us to bring God into the world, to make this world a godly place. And those two ideas are connected. I am who I am. We have to make God who we want God to be. And if we don't do that, then will God actually be there?
Oh, interesting. When you were talking about God contracting, I was thinking almost about God is so big and so unknowable that that contraction is just so that we can know this little piece. Just contract, God kind of has to contract down to what humanity can comprehend.
And when we talk about the Mishkan, we can talk about that again, because that's a great example of how God can, is contracted down, and at least in our way of thinking and in our actions.
Right. Yeah.
We can't fathom God as great as and vast as God is. We have to try and understand in our own limited ability, what we can understand of God.
Right. Can I just interject in here and just say that it is interesting how the first Christians reflected on these stories. So in the Gospel of John, we see I am come back again. And Jesus, over and over again, will use the phrase, I am the light of the world. I am the gate. I am the good shepherd. There's one moment where he seems to misuse language, and he says, before Abraham was, I am. And everyone knew that he was invoking the name that God had given Moses in the bush, and so they tried to throw Jesus off a cliff, and then he passes through their midst. So that name comes up again in reference to Jesus, and so we have Christians reflecting on this passage in Exodus 3 and attributing it to Jesus. Interestingly, in the Gospel of Matthew begins the Gospel with a long reflection on Jesus as sort of a new Moses figure. So we have another ruler, it's Herod this time, who seeks to kill all the male children of Nazareth, trying to get to Jesus, just like Pharaoh tried to kill all the Hebrew children in Egypt. And then Jesus, Mary, and Joseph head off to Egypt.
Right.
And they spend some time there, and then they make their own mini exodus back to Israel. And then the first thing that Jesus does in his new ministry is he goes to a top of a mountain,
gives a law,
and gives a new law in the Beatitudes, in the Sermon on the Mount. And it's definitely Matthew's way of saying, hey guys, you all know this story from Exodus, and I'm going to tell you that the story is related to the story I'm telling you about Jesus.
Right. Yeah, it's probably also worth saying that I'm forgetting. I think some of them do it differently, but the gospel writers all try and line up Jesus' death with Passover in some form or fashion. So again, there is this way of they're trying to invoke these foundational stories for Jewish peoples.
In almost every language except English, the word that we call Easter is related to Passover. So it's Pascha, Pasch.
Right.
The Paschal feast.
And
The
Easter
Paschal
is
feast.
also the only holiday, the only Christian holiday that goes according to the lunar calendar, where
Right.
all Jewish holidays go according to the lunar calendar.
Yep.
Yep.
So, and in Christianity, isn't the Passover Seder also considered to be the Last Supper? Or is that...
So
That's one of those,
In
yeah.
Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it
Depends
is a
who you ask.
Passover. It's a Passover supper, and in John, it's not. But
But John's a weird one anyway.
that's for a different podcast.
That's for a later podcast. We'll get there.
But you're right. But even John will they has Jesus being crucified
on the
at
Passover.
the exact same time that the lambs
Yes.
were being sacrificed for the
right.
Passover meal. So
That's the
even
difference
John is
there, it
saying
is.
Jesus is the Passover lamb who
Right.
is sacrificed for
Right.
us. So they're
Right.
all
Yes.
reflecting in different ways on Jesus and Passover.
Passover.
Right.
Yep. Got to know our history, folks. Spiritual history. Well, I think this is probably a good place for us to pause and before we get into the second half of Exodus. So,
Can we just say one more thing?
Oh yeah.
Yeah, okay,
Yes,
yeah.
of course.
go ahead.
Well, just thinking about what we take from what Judaism and Christianity together can take from the story of the Exodus, that's worth thinking about. You put that into my head. And one of the things that I think that is very relevant today is that it's not a good thing for nations to subjugate other nations or for people in power to subjugate people who are not in power. And we see this in many places in our world, and it's very distressing. And one of the things that's challenging for me as a rabbi at this moment in time is looking at what's happening in Gaza and on the West Bank, because this is the perfect picture of what shouldn't happen. This is why the Exodus story is so important to the people of Israel, so that this kind of thing won't happen. And so I just feel like
God is about liberation.
exactly.
Yeah.
And so so that's what's happening in Israel. Like, we can go to so many other countries.
Yeah.
But I'm a rabbi, so I'm talking about Israel.
Yeah, for sure.
So I just want to acknowledge that, because I think that's a really, it's a powerful.
If God is about liberation, then so are God's people to be about liberation.
Right.
Exactly. And if it's our responsibility to bring God into the world, then how do we do that?
Yeah,
we do
right.
that by liberating, not by
Subjugating.
oppressing and subjugating.
Right. That's so good. I'm just so compelled to add that I'm reflecting on your comments on the maturing that happens over the course of the Hebrew Scriptures. And when we get into the prophetic literature, which is far away from now, but there is this eschatological vision of justice for all nations. And that's really at the heart of what you're talking about, that there is an extension of Israel's mission beyond the Exodus to be a source of justice for all people.
A light unto the nations.
A light unto the nations. Exactly. Yeah.
I feel like I've sung that at some point.
You want to sing it for us now?
No, because I don't remember the tune. I'm like, that's definitely in Lent or Easter. Maybe it's in the Easter Vigil. At any rate. Well, I think we've wrapped up this first chunk of Exodus. Please join us again next week for more Exodus. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cross Connections Cover to Cover. New episodes drop each Wednesday. Please be sure to follow or like us on your favorite podcasting app to find us easily each week, or join us on our email list at stdavidschurch.org/crossconnections. If you have questions for us, you can call us at 484-588 888-5656 and leave a voicemail with your name, where you're from, and your question or comment. Please note, we may use your recorded voice in an upcoming episode of Cross Connections. If you like what you hear, we'd love if you would share this with your friends and rate us in Spotify and Apple Podcasts or whatever other app you're using so people can find us as well. Don't forget to visit our show notes for the year's reading list and any other resource links we've mentioned. Cross Connections is a ministry of St. David's Episcopal Church in Wayne, Pennsylvania. Season 2 Cover to Cover is hosted by
Rick Morley,
Elliot VanHoy,
and Natalee Hill. Logo graphic design and podcast production by Natalee Hill. Stock media music provided by Marscott and MoodMode Pond 5. You're welcome to learn more about all of St. David's worship and ministries at stdavidschurch.org.